But what I really want, and that continues all the way through to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1972. Sterling area is operating, as we know, because I've already talked about the devaluation of the pound through it, all the way through to 1972. The other key area was the passage of a series of colonial development and welfare acts in 1949, 1950, and 1959. These acts were basically first designed to try and rescue the ailing British economy, to try and develop colonial economies in ways that would make them satellites of the British economy, provide them raw materials and provide them new markets for Britain's failing export industries. But the welfare component of these development acts, which was new in 1949, was also a gesture to the fact that the empire would also, that colonies would also have access to some of the forms of welfare that were being championed in the social democratic system in Britain. Now, in no way did they receive anything like the welfare services that British citizens had, but it was a gesture to the fact that colonial government was now newly orientated around the welfare of colonial subjects. It was therefore, in part, a deliberate attempt to defuse growing nationalist unrest and labour unrest across the British Empire, particularly in the Caribbean and in East and West Africa. Now, so far I've just been talking to you about the attempt to strengthen the British Empire, to make the British Empire endure in new types of ways. I also have to account for the way in which the British Empire falls apart. And one of the great mythologies that British historians have long had about the process of decolonisation was, because we always like to contrast ourselves to the French, that whereas decolonisation for France was a bloody and protracted affair, in Britain it was peaceable and pragmatic. That at a certain point, imperial administrators just decided to lower the flag and gracefully exit the country, having fostered the independence of new nation-states. This is a complete sham. But this process begins in 1947 and 1948 with a relatively peaceable withdrawal from India, Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon, and Palestine. I say relatively peaceful because clearly the partition of India and Pakistan was a violent and a mess, which displaced hundreds and thousands of people. The real issue was how could the British Empire maintain itself militarily. And here we see that in the 1950s, the same techniques of military repression that the British Empire had developed for over a century was used in earnest to try and cling on to certain imperial territories. There was violent repression against anti-colonial struggles in the 1950s in Ghana, in Malaya, in Kenya, and in the Suez Crisis in Egypt. I'm going to focus just on the Kenyan case, because I can't possibly cover all of those different places. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya basically lasted between 1952 and 1956. It was brutally suppressed by the British colonial government that built concentration camps, which you'll remember had first been pioneered during the South African War of 1899 to 1901. An estimated 160 to 320,000 people were detained in these concentration camps as a way of trying to restrain the so-called guerrilla tactics of the Mau Mau revolt. And in those camps, there was resort to the use of forced labour, to starvation rations, and to the rape of women and girls. Indeed, there's estimated to have been somewhere between 130 and 300,000 deaths in those camps in these years. There was, importantly, a growing reaction against this repression in Kenya. Okay, remember that this critique of the British Empire and of the violent methods of the British Empire had been around for a while. Remember Campbell Bannerman talking about the methods of barbarism in South Africa. What is important here is that there is beginning to be a break in the party political responses to anti-colonial, to the suppression of anti-colonial movements. A good example of this is that figures both on the left of the Labour Party and the right of the Conservative Party begin to coalesce. And in the case of Kenya, we have Barbara Castle, a member of the Labour Party, and a character known as Enoch Powell, who I'll come back to later on, both arguing that this was a disgrace. In fact, Enoch Powell said the Tory party must be cured of the British Empire and the pitiful yearning to cling to the relics of a bygone system. Now, he'll put that to very particular use, as you'll see, but the important point is that there are people across both political parties responding negatively to these attempts. There's also the formation of this organisation called the Movement of Colonial Freedom in 1954. And it's a movement that sets itself apart from the official, it's basically people on the left, disillusioned with the Labour Party's policy of not supporting movements for independence. The Labour Party, many people on the left felt, should embrace colonial nationalist and anti-colonial movements. But in fact, they didn't, even when they were in opposition. There were as much as 70 Labour MPs who were part of this, supporters of this organisation, including Barbara Castle and Tony Benn, who you saw do that fabulous swivel in the Labour radio and TV centre in the election campaign. And they all campaigned against the introduction of the 1962 Immigration Act, which I'll return to in a minute. Basically, by the late 1950s, it was apparent that the political support for the maintenance of empire violently had been lost. And in 1960, Harold Macmillan, Anthony Eden's successor, delivers his famous Winds of Change speech in the South African Parliament, saying effectively, well, you can listen to that video because it's on the course website, saying effectively that the winds of change are blowing through the continent of Africa and that independence was just around the corner. And it was. Ghana and Malaya became independent in 1957, Somaliland, Nigeria and Cyprus in 1960, Sierra Leone, some Cameroons and Tanganyika in 1961, Jamaica, Trinidad and Uganda in 1962, Singapore, Zanzibar and Kenya in 1963, Gambia and the Maldives in 1965, Tonga and Fiji in 1970. An amazing pack of cards falling within the space, basically, of a decade. Now, the lowering of the flag, of course, didn't mean that Britain's imperial influence was immediately removed. Indeed, historians would now argue that the economic and cultural ties of the Third British Empire persisted long after the achievement of formal independence. That, in fact, The post-colony doesn't become post until many decades after independence. And indeed, as we still see today in many parts of the world, the consequences of the British Empire and the systems of rule established there have continued to create structurally enormously difficult problems politically for places like, for instance, Zimbabwe. Okay. You still with me? A lot to get through today. A lot of the world to range over. Does anyone have any questions so I can just draw my breath before we hurtle through the last part of the lectures? No? You're with me? Fabulous. Okay, so let me now turn the focus to Britain itself and the impact of colonial migration in the wake of decolonisation. Now, when I was a boy, many decades ago, we used to have an understanding that basically Britain was an all-white country until 1947, when two ships arrived from the Caribbean, the SS Orbiter and the Empire Windrush. And that these boatloads of guest workers, effectively, colonial subjects recruited to the British labour market, represented the first arrival of people of colour in Britain. We now know that that was a wrong-headed idea. And I'm not even going to go back into the deep history of slavery and the story of Jews in the 17th and 18th and early 19th century. What I'm going to focus on instead is basically two categories of people. People who work, people who were labourers, and the intellectual leaders of what became anti-colonial movements. Both of which predated by decades this moment of 1947. So, in the 1920s and 1930s, there had been a good amount of official concern with what were known as coloured seamen. Okay? These coloured seamen were basically, I know, I can see the smiles across your face, you've got to focus, this does not have anything to do with flavoured condoms or anything else. But now you've got me going. It's not fair. I need you to see straight faces in front of me. Okay, got it. So, yeah, about coloured seamen. These coloured seamen were basically merchant that worked in the merchant shipping industry, okay? And they came from across and beyond the British Empire. Okay? They came from East Asia, they came from Southeast Asia, they came from the Pacific Islands, they came from West Africa, they came from East Africa, they came from the Middle East. It's a huge variety of different people who basically got work on ships that were headed to Britain and then had layoffs in between their next journey abroad. And in the 1920s, they become categorised as coloured seamen, and the state begins to try and regulate the amount of time that they're in the country. What's important about these groups of people is that in the big port towns like London and Cardiff and Liverpool, you have the development of multi-racial communities and multi-racial relationships in these areas. And this develops in the 1920s and the 1930s. Indeed, in 1933, there's even a League of Coloured Peoples established to protect the civil rights of these people, and particularly to focus on their rights to employment in Britain. This League of Coloured Peoples attracted the support and involvement of figures like the Caribbean writer C.L.R. James and the founder of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. The other group of people who had long been present in Britain was, of course, the leader of anti-colonial movements who often came to Britain to study in British universities or, in the case of Indian leaders, very often to take law exams in Britain. A great example of this is the meeting of the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. There had been, I think, the 3rd Pan-African Congress had been held in London in the 1920s. This 5th Pan-African Congress was organised by the Ghanaian nationalist leader Kwame Nkrumah and included Kenyatta and the grand old man of Dubois. And there were 35 delegates from British organisation representing the interests of people of colour in Britain. So a substantive presence before 1947. Nonetheless, it's clearly the case that the numbers of colonial subjects and colonial migrants increased importantly in the decades following the war. In part, this is encouraged by the British government. In 1948, they passed the British Nationality Act, which provides all imperial subjects full rights as British citizens, with full access to the social democratic welfare state and, of course, equality, the idea of equality before the law. And many of these people were recruited, as was the people on board the Windrush and the Orbiter, recruited to work by the government, either in the National Health Service as auxiliary workers or by private companies like the London Transport Company. The numbers of colonial migrants, though, was incredibly small. So between 1951 and 1961, I'm going to throw out some figures and I'll repeat them, so don't worry. The Afro-Caribbean population in Britain grew from 16 to 66,000 people, 16 to 66,000. The number of Indians in Britain increased from 110,000 to 275,000. And the number of Pakistanis grew from 11,000 to 119,000. Okay, so still, the numbers are incredibly small. We're talking about less than 500,000 people from these three key areas of colonial migration. But what it does do is it begins to shift the racial geography of Britain. No longer are people of colour confined to these neighbourhoods in port towns. Instead, what you have is the development, the following of these colonial migrants to places of industrial labour. So critically in the Midlands, around the engineering factories of Birmingham, Coventry and Leicester, and in the northwest, around the textile industries of Manchester, Bradford, Oldham and Rochdale. What you also have is the acceleration of the formation of new organisations trying to represent the interests of these colonial migrants. So I've given you three examples here. The Indian Workers' Association, established in 1958, the same year that Claudia Jones set up the West Indian Gazette, the newspaper published out of Notting Hill in London, and the Committee Against Racial Discrimination, set up in 1961. I don't have time to show you that, so we'll just move on to this. Migration, though, wasn't simply about people of colour, or indeed even colonial subjects, or former colonial subjects. The labour shortage after the war meant that European migration, migration across Europe, was also encouraged. And it was encouraged through the European Voluntary Worker Scheme, the EVWs. And here we have many people displaced by the experience of the Second World War. Poles were the most numerous, 145,000 of them, but there were also 90,000 people from the Baltic states, as well as, of course, a new wave of migration of people from Ireland. Interestingly, a whole bunch of people from southern Italy, mainly to work in the brick industries in the East Midlands, and a small number of Jews who chose to stay in Britain or were allowed to stay in Britain rather than heading across to the United States. There's a fabulous film, whose name I'm forgetting now. Does anyone know what this is? It's a great film about a Jewish and Caribbean family living in London in the 1950s, and how the West Indian family teaches this young Jewish boy to play cricket, and how it is that, him learning to play cricket was the way in which he becomes English, and he's taught how to do that by a Jamaican. Does anyone know the name of that film? It'll come to me by the end of the lecture. It's a wonderful film. It's about 7 years old. The other flow of migration was actually from Britain to the broader so-called British Anglo world. Emigration was actually encouraged by the British government, and indeed numbers of immigrants actually exceeds the numbers of migrants of immigrants through the early 1950s. And this is in large part because of this scheme, the assisted passage scheme, which gave Britons a very cheap deal of transportation out to the so-called white dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Rhodesia, South Africa, and Kenya. But the largest numbers of people go to Australia, 140,000 between 1946 and 1951, and just under 50,000 go to New Zealand to become hobbits. Sorry, Sam. We actually have two Kiwis in the audience as well, so that was really uncalled for. I do apologise. Anyway. Colonial migration to Britain creates a reaction of the development of white racism in a new organised forms, as well as some pretty traditional unorganised forms. What it does is catalyse what I'm calling here the white defence of a so-called white British way of life against what people at the time described as colours. And you see here, Stop the Coloured Invasion demonstration in Trafalgar Square in 1959. There have been a series of race riots in Britain in the aftermath of the First World War, but they really accelerated in the 1950s. In Nottingham and Notting Hill in 1958, in Middlesbrough in 1961, which is in the northeast, and in Dudley, which is just north of Birmingham, in 1962. All of these riots are basically aimed not just at the idea of a cultural invasion of coloured people, but of the age-old critique of immigrants that they're stealing our houses, they're stealing our jobs, they're stealing our social services, and they're stealing our women. Now this racism finds expression in new organised political forms. Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, is the first person to pick up the baton, forms a union movement in 1948, and stands in the by-election in Notting Hill just after the race riots there in 1959. Much more importantly, though, was the receptive home that white racist politics had in the fringes of the Conservative Party. Groups like the Birmingham Immigration Control Association, set up in 1960, begin to exercise a quite powerful role on local constituency elections and politics. And in some areas, you have, and Smethwick, which is spelled, you're never going to be able to guess how this is spelled S-M-E-T-H-W-I-C-K. You have the development of candidates like Peter Griffith and Cyril Osborne up in Birmingham, pioneering a really explicit racist politics, as you can see from this election poster here. If you want a colour for Labour, vote Labour. If you already have, I can't read this, if you're already burdened with one, vote Tory. Okay? In part, as a response to this growing white racism, the Conservative government, just as it had in 1904, when the first Aliens Act had been introduced in Britain, remember, in the advance of an election the following year, so in 1962, as an election is looming and the popularity of the Conservative Party is fading, they introduced a Commonwealth Immigration Act, which tries to restrict the numbers of immigrants through the introduction of a voucher scheme for certain key categories of workers. What the 1962 Immigration Act also does, however, is introduce new systems for trying to formalise systems attempting to integrate the so-called coloured communities into British society as a whole. And this is taken in two forms. First, you have the use of the old imperial knowledge of anthropology, of social anthropology, put to work to study so-called coloured communities in Britain.